right, students, Chapter 16 is about reform movements in the United States that happened in the years leading up to the Civil War, between the era of good feelings and the Civil War. People started looking at how things were going in our country and deciding that there might be something better. All right, the springboard for all of these reform movements was something called the Second Great Awakening. If you remember, the First Great Awakening happened before the Revolution and helped inspire the Revolution. And at this point in our country's history, during the mid-1800s, 1830s, 40s, 50s, people came around again to religion and thinking that we had turned away somehow from the Lord, and people began having revivals, which were giant, huge outdoor religious meetings. And sometimes these would go on for days or even weeks, and people would travel for miles around to hear these speakers come and have these revivals. Some of the groups that came from this period of time would be the Mormons, like Joseph Smith. And a lot of these groups, and not just the Mormons, thought of creating a utopia for their followers. But regardless, the turning back to religion and the self-inspection that religion would cause you to have made people begin to look at the rest of their society and question as how they could make it better. One of the things that came out of this was the temperance movement. I'm sorry about my formatting. Hold on. Okay, slightly better. The temperance movement was a movement mostly by women against the drinking of alcohol and the manufacture of it. What was happening, especially in the industrial North, was that men would be going out after work and they'd be stopping at the local pub and having, a few drinks with their friends or whatever, but they'd be spending too much money on it. And once you got married and had children back in those days, there's no daycare. So you are at home with those children. And if your husband is out blowing his money on having fun with his friends, it's not a good thing, because literally in some cases it's taking food out of the mouths of your children. So some of these women decided that they should start crusading against this. And it wasn't just the women. Also, employers saw the value in not having their employees out, carousing all night long, and sort of putting a stop to some of this behavior. It wasn't a question of you shouldn't do it at all. It's just temperance means to draw back, to, instead of eating the whole pizza, just eat a couple pieces of pizza. Now, in its extreme case, many of these women did want people to stop drinking entirely, and in some states, they did start to ban the manufacture and consumption of alcohol. Please don't get this confused with prohibition, which happened in the 1920s, or the 19-teens and 1920s. This comes later on, but this is the earliest form of it. Okay, so there's some changes in education at this time, and my little guy horse man up there is cut off. But there's not a whole lot of public education. There is some, and where there is some, it's more in the north, except for places like Texas and Florida, which I've made mention of in the past. Obviously, African Americans don't face an equal education because they're not allowed to go to school with white people. And also women are not getting the same equal education. Girls are often allowed to go to school up until maybe junior high age. And then they are usually shipped off to the factories or whatever in the north. And so they don't really get a higher education. And of course in the south there's almost no public schooling. Now I would say the exception to this would be upper class women. Your upper class women, your wealthier families would see that their girl daughters, their female children are educated, at least to high school level probably, because those women are going to be expected to marry wealthy men. And wealthy men wanted to have a wife who could host dinner parties for their wealthy friends and carry on conversations in an intelligent way. And so those girls would be more educated, even in the South. Those girls would be sent to school or schooled at home by tutors to a higher degree than in some of the other places. But you need to know Horace Mann, because he was one of the first people who decided that there should be a college for teachers, so that teachers would learn a proper way of educating children, and also for other education reforms. Okay, these people are not tested, Gallaudet and Howe, but it is important, I think, that you notice that folks started looking at people with disabilities and saying, oh, you know what? These people can learn too. It wasn't that people with hearing impairments or visual impairments were shunned or put aside. It was just that they were not helped to try to teach them anything. But Hal began printing Braille books so that people who had vision problems could learn because they could now read with Braille. And Gallaudet developed methods of teaching hearing impaired people how to learn and how to consume information. In fact, there's a college named after him in Ohio that is called Gallaudet College for the Deaf. It's for deaf and profoundly hearing disabled people. All right, you need to know this woman, Dorothea Dix. She's highly important. And she becomes important working with prison reform and for crusading for help for the mentally ill. And she also crosses over and works with women's rights and somewhat in abolition. But you need to remember prison reform and mental health reform. Those are the two most important for her. And she comes about this by accident. She was trying to bring Sunday school lessons into women's prisons. And when she got into the women's prisons, realized that not all of these women were they were not all like criminals. Some of them were there because they were depressed or they had some other mental problem. And she wondered, why would these people be thrown into jail when really that wasn't what they needed. They needed help, mental help, but not being thrown in jail with criminals. And so she that was like her first experience. And then she went around and saw that this was not just in one place, but in numerous places around the country. And then eventually realized this was happening for men too. Of course, she was not allowed into men's prisons because that was back in the day when women wouldn't be in there. But she finds out that this is happening in many places and begins really crusading against this practice and begins having mental health hospitals opened up. And again, the prisons were in bad shape and getting the prisons reformed as well. I don't want you to think it's anything equivalent to what we would have as modern day mental health practices, but it certainly was a huge step in the right direction, and she really made a big difference, all on her own, mostly at first. Okay, we need to talk about Thoreau and Emerson, but mostly Thoreau here. Emerson is going to be mentioned later on in other parts, like he's a writer. Thoreau was mostly just a thinker. And they are known in this world of transcendentalism. And these people were thinking about their thinking is the best way I can describe it. They were concentrating on the inner person, concentrating on your inner conscience. Thoreau was from a very wealthy family, but he chose to go live in a hut in the woods and contemplate nature. You know, how birds build nests, how ants build anthills, and just think about all of that. And so he was shunning his family's wealth. And there was one other thing he's very famous for, and that's this. And oh, look, it's all in red. And there's big words. So Mrs. Butts needs you to remember this. Civil disobedience is a huge, important concept. It'll be tested countless times. Because the concept of civil disobedience is that you will break a law, but you are willing to pay the price for it. And this was Thoreau. He truly believed that slavery was immoral, and he believed that the government was supporting slavery, or at the very least, neglecting to do anything about it. And so he refused to pay taxes to a government that was supporting slavery, or at the very least doing nothing about it. At the same time, James Polk was president during these years, and Polk, as you know, was his Manifest Destiny campaign. And Thoreau was one of those people who believed that Polk was trying to grab up land so he could create more slave states. So again, even more reason for Thoreau not to pay taxes. He was willing to go to jail for not paying his taxes, and he did go to jail for not paying his taxes. So that's an important concept that you need to understand. It's civil disobedience is usually disobeying a law, and not violently, but peacefully disobeying a law, but being willing to take the hit for it. You're not trying to escape the punishment. Okay, during this time, up to this point in time, actually, in the United States, if you wanted to study literature and art, you would be studying British people or European people. But between the time of the Revolution and the signing of the Constitution and the early 1800s, we began to grow our own crop of literary people and artists. And some of these people are Longfellow, who you will have to know. You need to put him together with Hiawatha, which was a very long poem about a Native American. Emerson, who you heard of before, was a poet, also transcendentalist, wrote about leaves of grass. Again, he's out there contemplating the leaves of grass. Okay, that's transcendentalism. And Emily Dickinson was part of this new literary wave, and that she was a woman poet, and it's unusual to have a woman involved in something like that, and also was writing very flowery, very descriptive poems about the natural world. But these three people are important because we had a literary sort of revolution at the same time. And lastly, we have the Hudson River School. It's an art school founded on the Hudson River in New York. It says so in its name. And the idea was to explore topics that were purely American, beautiful landscapes of the new American frontier.